and the differences we can see in people's brains compared to those who are anxious and who aren't on a clinical level. I worked at a brain injury clinic for quite a while as well as a rehabilitation support worker. And then I began at Billesley in the incredible Montessori nursery they have there. And it allowed me to practice a lot of the things that I'd learned in childhood brain development, which was amazing. Then I became a teacher at Billesley Primary School and a research associate, and I have been learning ever since. I've delivered quite a few brain development training programs for Birmingham schools, and I've just recently become part of the amazing virtual school that the Elliott Foundation offers, and I have devised lessons in reading, writing, art, and P4C. So today, aims of the session. So we're going to try and understand the basic theory of working memory, basic theory of memory, but with a focus on working memory. And we're going to look at the link between working memory and the recommendation 4 from the EEF Guide to Metacognition. And then we're going to look at working memory in the classroom, specifically looking at cognitive load and the potential ways in which we can reduce it. And there are elements within each of the causes of cognitive load that could probably have a session within themselves, but we'll try and get through as much as possible. And also I will provide you with literature, a section of the presentation as well that includes the theories and the ideas in how to reduce those things. So quick question for everybody, I guess if you want to type it in the live chat. Why do you think that it's important to focus on memory in the classroom? You just want to type your answers if you want to. Yeah. 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 There's loads of amazing ideas. I'm worried now that it's kind of redundant what I'm about to do. But yeah, absolutely. It's interesting that some people have mentioned working memory there already, and also long-term memory and avoiding superficial learning, which is so true. And interestingly, it's working memory that is a key factor in ensuring that long-term memory, and it's such a cyclical process. So that's why we're focusing on working memory today. But massively long-term memory comes into that. Absolutely about not avoiding superficial learning as well. That's a really crucial point. And yes, many children do have problems with memory, and it's such a shame because it is a barrier for their learning. When if it was removed, they could fulfill their full potential. So just briefly, human memory involves the ability to preserve and recover information. We use this information to help us complete any given task or engage with new learning. So in this sort of diagram here, you can see how they're linked, but the acquisition and also the rehearsal of a skill requires working memory, and the enhancement of long-term memory also requires a functioning working memory in order to avoid that superficial learning. So we'll briefly look now at the theory of memory and how it works. So I've tried to sort of think about the ways that I personally almost visualize memory. Now, working memory I see is basically it's a store for any information that you're conscious of in a moment, and you use this information to complete any given task in that moment. And your long-term memory is a store of all of the things that you've learned over your lifetime. So there's a little image here, which I'm realizing is actually a bit weird, but it's showing you that throughout your life you gain these memories, and ideally they are stored and they're stable. They're not temporary and they're in your long-term memory, but largely they're unconscious until you bring them into your working memory, which is sort of the live area of our minds. They're largely unconscious and stored away. So let's have a look at this. I'm going to use the example of someone in the classroom, and in their environment, they're exposed to the question, what is 23 plus 7? So their environment, their incoming information is 23 plus 7. So instantly, in our live memory, in our working memory, we're storing this information and we're conscious of it. And we need to hold it there. We need to keep it in our working memory in order to complete whatever question we've been given. So here we've been given the question 23 plus 7. So we're holding it in this live, conscious, temporary store, which is our working memory. And almost instantly and unconsciously, we retrieve information from our long-term memory that we already have that would aid us in understanding this concept. So for example, number bonds to 10, the steps for regrouping, and these instantly, as soon as you're aware of these, they are in your working memory, because the working memory is the live conscious store of information that you are conscious of. So all of this goes into your working memory. So now you have all the pieces of information, you are holding them or trying to retain them in your working memory, you're thinking about them, and you're going to try and use them to solve this problem that you've been given. Now, you might use lots of different techniques like visualization of the numbers, but the whole time you need to retain this key information, because once it's lost, it's lost. So ideally, you retain all the information in your working memory, again, which is like this live action workspace that holds all the information that you're conscious of and that you need, and you come to the answer. And this is positive as well, because the more that you do this, the more success you have in retaining information in your working memory. You can complete a task, and once you complete that task, that reinforces, or you rehearse that skill, which leads to a much deeper storage of it in your long-term memory. So for new learning, working memory is so crucial, because perhaps we don't have all the pieces at this moment in time in our long-term memory. So let's imagine again that our teacher has said to us, the first step is to add the ones. And now imagining that you haven't got any visual aids around you reminding you of this information, you need to keep that in your working memory, again, which is this store of information that you're conscious of, and it's going to help you solve this task. You might instantaneously and unconsciously retrieve information from your long-term memory that you have about adding knowledge, what tens and ones are, and that's all put together then. You're all holding this information. Ideally, you complete the task, and with that successful completion of the task, using the things that you have in your working memory, you then increase your chances of successfully storing that in your long-term memory. So we can see here the information on the knowledge how to add one successfully has been added in a meaningful way into our long-term memory, because we were able to use the skills, we were able to use information in our working memory to successfully complete that task. Now, this is why it's so important, because we need to retain this information in our working memory so we can complete tasks, any tasks that we're given. And as we've seen, if you successfully complete this task, and that might just be as simple as understanding what you've been given, that will lead to longer term storage. That will lead to stable long-term storage of that piece of information. Now, completing any new learning as well is exactly the same. You need to retain the information in your live action workspace. And if you complete that successfully, and you in that moment with your working memory, you're more likely to retain it in the long term. So at any point, information can be lost from our working memory. So we might lose all of the information, but likely we lose pieces of it. And suddenly we don't have all of the pieces that we need to solve a puzzle, to solve whatever it is that we've been given, the task we've been given. Now, importantly with working memory is that, oh, there's someone raised a hand. I think I can see a hand. Yes? Did someone raise a hand? I'm not sure.
I don't think so, Christie. I think it was a comment.
Okay. So how does forgetting happen in our working memory? And that's what we're going to look at. We're going to look at how we lose these key pieces of incoming information from our live working memory, which means that we cannot then complete a given task, which in turn means it affects the understanding we have of that task and how it's stored in our long-term memory. Now, importantly, once the information has gone from our working memory, it's gone. And we have to either start the process again, look for cues to remind ourselves of that information. So the working memory has a limited store, as I'm sure everyone can empathise with that. Before things start to overspill and fall out of our working memory, we have the capacity of about 5 items. So we're able to, without visual aids, we're able to keep in our conscious live store of information, we're able to keep about 5 items there. And then we use those in whatever way we can to solve a problem or simply understand the world happening around us. There is also a theory of, I think 5 items is, like, in most modern literature is kind of accepted, but there's also Miller's theory, which is that the average is 7 items, and then it's plus or minus 2. Does it vary between people? Absolutely. There are lots of things that come into play with how much we can store in our working memory at a given time. Age is a factor. Our working memory increases as we age, but there is some interesting research which we'll go into as to why that happens. Genetics, as with a lot of things to do with cognition, is a factor 100%, but also poverty is a massive factor in predicting somebody's working memory capacity. And this is thought to be for a series of reasons, one of which we will go into later. Also, there is most recent, there's been a molecule in the brain that's been discovered that's been associated with working memory, which is really interesting as well. And there's some literature about that linked below. So what does a child with poor working memory look like? So again, for our working memory, we need to store as much information as we can consciously in this store, which is our working memory. So often they can't remember instructions with more than 2 parts. So if you say, go and put your coats in the corner by the stairs, each part of that instruction begins to get lost because they can't retain all of it in their conscious working memory. They often require a lot of reminders and a lot of visual aids, even if it's things that you've just said and you've just spoken about. The forgetting happens very quickly and they lose that information, particularly when they've got a stream of incoming information. And this is important steps that you know they can complete in isolation, but when it's presented in a series of facts, perhaps above 5 items, they're very easily lost. Working memory problems can be associated with attentional problems. So actually most teachers, for children that have working memory issues, most teachers actually say that they think the child has attentional issues, and they might say the phrase in one ear and out the other. But actually it's just because very easily their conscious store of information becomes full and they start to lose key pieces. So it happens in about, I think, significantly low working memory is in about 10% of children. And also it's important to remember that the classroom is such a instructional, multi-step heavy environment. So it's actually no wonder that a lot of these children do struggle. I just wanted to ask you a question. First of all, does everything make sense? If it doesn't, I totally understand. And also, in relation to that, what examples can you think of in your day-to-day adult life where you have to use your working memories, that sort of temporary store of conscious information that you have to try and sustain? If you just want to type any examples, that's fine. Yeah, asking for directions. Yeah. Yeah, mental list when shopping, absolutely. Driving somewhere, yeah. Shopping list, yeah, absolutely. And we all try and keep these things conscious enough so we can complete the task. But so easily it can get lost. Why did I come upstairs? Story of my life, absolutely. Okay, so is working memory the same as IQ? And I think this is where we have to give some of our children a reevaluation, in that this question here, 156 add 287. The understanding addition a child might have for something like 21 add 21. But when they're presented with a question like this, there are so many more steps that have to be gone through. The regrouping, visualizing more numbers, things like that. So what happens is that this child here, their understanding, they're not able to complete the problem, even though their understanding of addition is exactly the same as the child with a normal or high functioning working memory. It's just that the high functioning working memory child can recall all of the steps mentally in order to complete a task. I did see another raised hand, but I don't know if that's just if someone wants to speak. Oh, no, I don't know how to do that. Okay. I'm not sure if I have to answer raised hands or anything. So if you want to type any questions in the comment section as we go, I'll try and address them straight away. So it's important basically to assess our children based on their working memory capacity as well, because it might be they actually have just as much of a capability for understanding addition as the child who has an average or high functioning working memory. It's just that it's so much harder for them to retain all those steps in that conscious live store. So can it be improved? It can. As with anything, our genetics do often set a certain limit to which we can achieve, but the variation within that very much depends on the environment. So it's that nature-nurture argument. There are things we can do that can help, and that's a universal strategies. And there are things that we can do that will hinder how much we can store in our working memory. There are also a lot of tricks we can learn. So for example, in the image in the top right, there was a man, I can't remember his name, and he could remember all of the digits to pi at any given moment. And people sort of interpreted that as him having an excellent working memory. But actually, when they gave him a series of random symbols that he hadn't seen before or pre-rehearsed, his working memory was exactly the same as any average student. So he'd learned tips and tricks for him to remember such a long series of numbers in his working memory as well. So there are lots of things we can do that will impact a child's working memory, and there's lots of things they can do as well to improve it, which we will look at. So before we look at the ways in which we can improve a child's working memory, I thought we would look briefly at cognitive load theory. Has anybody done much about this before? Okay, a lot. Okay, excellent. Perfect. So there's intrinsic cognitive load, and that sort of overload of the working memory happens when a task that we're given is just inherently too hard for us, and that can be for a numerous amount of reasons. Cognitive load in terms of extraneous cognitive load is all about how we present information to children or to anyone, how information is presented to us and how that impacts the amount of information we retain in our working memory. And Jermaine is all about schemas, which we'll look at. So it's about how a lack of long-term schematic knowledge can also overload our working memory. And the coffee image is like an overspill of information as well. So before we begin, before we begin that main part, I just wanted to know if anybody knows already the 4 components that people consider the working memory to have. So imagine this as different stores for different types of information, and there's some clues on the screen. So does anybody have any ideas what different types of stores we have in our working memory, the different types of information we hold? Yeah, visual, auditory, yeah, absolutely. So what we have is we have something called a phonological loop. And this is essentially a storage of sounds. Now, interestingly, this doesn't just mean incoming information from the outside. This means your inner ear as well. So when you look at a number, that's actually and you look at the number and you recognize that that's actually your phonological loop, because essentially you're speaking that number to yourself inside your head, even if it's not conscious. So it's a storage of sounds, and it allows you to temporarily memorize the digits, words, and sentences. And it's all defined by the way things sound. Now, the visuospatial sketchpad is all about images. So it's about how much we can store images, but also how much we can manipulate images in our working memory. And the central executive, now that's sort of like it has a responsibility to direct your attention to anything it thinks it needs. And that might be something from the environment, or it might be something from your long-term memory. The episodic buffer has much less research around it, so we won't go into that today. But it basically is the part of your working memory that stores the order of things that happen. So the phonological the phonological loop in our working memory stores things like digits, letters, words, and sentences. Interestingly, in Japan, on average, a person will have a higher store limit in their working memory for sounds, because the language actually, within one symbol, there'll be many sounds associated with it. So that shows as well the fact that it can be affected and changed. If we go onto the visuospatial sketchpad, you might have a problem like this, where someone asks you would use that to solve a problem like this, which is where somebody might ask you to visualize something. It's basically where you store anything to do with imagery. So if you're drawing a flower, you look at the flower, you hold that in your working memory when you put your pencil to the paper, and you're using the imagery part of your working memory, which we've gone through. Now, a really interesting way to think of the working memory, which I found helpful, is thinking of it as a workbench. So basically, your working memory is the workbench, and your central executive is like the carpenter who decides on what's being made and retrieves tools and works on them in the moment. And our long-term memory is like a long-term store. It's like a long-term store of our tools, our toolkit. And there's a link down there to a really great document that just works through working memory and continually describes it through that analogy. So let's get on to recommendation 4. So set an appropriate level of challenge to develop pupils' self-regulation and metacognition. Now, from that, I think super important is that this element here, which is that tasks should not overload people's cognitive processes, particularly when they're expected to apply new strategies. And as we've already learned, or we've already looked at through working memory, is that it has a capacity and it can become overloaded. And we're going to look at how that happens in a moment. So after a while, we can almost take down that initial recommendation and break it down into, for an example, how do we give children their optimal working memory capacity? Or if you like the workbench analogy, how do you give children their optimal mental workbench? So we come back to cognitive load now, and we're going to look at the different ways in which we can overload children in relation to this theory. So let's begin with, in fact, we can skip through that for now. Let's begin with extraneous cognitive load and the solutions that we have. So this is all about how we present information to children, and it's about the environment as well that can impact working memory. So The first thing is that music should be avoided. And it's really tricky because I know that a lot of children are very drawn to music while they learn, but the evidence shows that it does quite significantly impact a child's working memory, just because of the incoming store of auditory information that can almost push out what you want them to be focusing on in that live conscious store. And interestingly, it doesn't matter whether it's a foreign language. It doesn't matter if it's without lyrics. If there's any change in tone, your brain is trying to register that and is storing it in its working memory. It's interesting because there's a lot of literature out there about why children are so drawn to something that isn't actually beneficial for them. And a lot of it is to do with anxiety. It can calm anxiety for children, which is a very valid point. But also, if you have a particularly noisy environment, by providing a song, you can allow children to focus on that, and ideally what's in their working memory that they're being taught, and it sort of pushes out external noise. But that's quite rare and it requires good attentional levels. So just generally, no music is advised to allow children to enjoy their optimal working memory. And that leads on to sound as well. So any sort of sound disturbances, your mind, your brain almost can't help but internalize them somewhat, and this can push out the information that's in your phonological store. And it's interesting because a lot of teaching is speaking while children are doing, or speaking while children are reading. And this incoming vocal sound can often push out what you want them to have in their conscious temporary store. The information that you want them to use to solve a problem kind of gets pushed out with the live marking, for example, children talking, perhaps there's a disruptive, something disruptive within the classroom, or simply that you're giving them things to look at, and it's very natural to sort of want to speak and clarify things as you go. So when presenting something to a child, particularly for the first time, in order for their working memory to have full capacity, people think that perhaps it's best to reduce the amount, obviously reduce the amount of sound that surrounds them, but also be conscious of how much you're talking and when. Another thing is environment. So when you look at your environment within your school, and there's lots of research about this recently, particularly if a child has poor attention, if they're drawn to a lot of stimulation within the room, and they're reading things and they're looking at things, all these internal thought processes are replacing what you want them to have in their working memory at the time. And Bilsey Primary School have led so much of this, and they've really implemented a lot of research into how to make a classroom kind of quiet, almost for your inner ear, the classroom is quiet. So here's just a few examples of the pictures, and I'll provide you with links to their Instagram as well. And there's links to a lot of research as well that can guide you in how to create a classroom that doesn't overload a child's working memory through their inner ear. Clean presentation of information is another really important thing. So we think about how much information we can store at one point. And if we give children a lot of information in one go, whether it's on a slide or a resource, it can easily overwhelm them and information can become lost. So whenever we're thinking about what we present, we need to think about whether it's purposeful, whether it makes other information redundant, and if it does, then we can just get rid of it. So it's thinking about every single thing that we present to a child on a screen or a resource, thinking about the amount that we present, thinking about the purpose of it, whether we need it, because if there's too much on that screen or too much on that resource, a child's working memory easily becomes overloaded, and they almost can't decide what they need to use and what they don't. So if we just look at something, this is called, oh, it's not loading. Okay, this is something called the split attention effect, for example. So when we present, what should be on the screen is when we present children with images side by side, images side by side, it creates something called a split attention effect. So our children and their working memories are constantly trying to decide what they should pay attention to. And in that process, they start to lose key pieces of information from their working memory. Interestingly, this remains even if on a daily basis you are someone who does switch between tasks a lot. And the more you do that, in fact, the more you live in an environment or a world where you switch your attention between things, that can really negatively impact your working memory, because you're essentially training your memory, your working memory and your attention to switch between things without staying there long enough. And that's something that's really definitely an issue in modern day media as well. And just sort of our addiction to technology and things like that. Ah, there's the image, okay. So if we look at a slide that's quite busy, and I won't go into this too much, and then we compare it straight away with something that's very clean, and this is taken from the, this is using the virtual schools layout, we can instantly say how much easier it is to focus on one thing, to retain all the information that we need, and also the information is purposeful. So if something is lost from a child's working memory, they can access it very easily, but in a way that's not going to overload them. There's so many resources out there, again, that present so much information at one time and causes us to have this overspill and lose information as well. Now, there's another interesting thing with working memory. We've already spoken about how it isn't quite the same as attention, but attention is something that can improve it or can take away from our working memory ability. And I won't go too much into this now because this is a whole other topic. But it is important to know that there are people who are developing computer training programs to improve attention in children. It originated in children with ADHD, and it can be, initially research does suggest that it can be applied to the average child as well. So that is something as well to consider and think about, because that improvement in attention can help and facilitate the child's working memory capacity. And we'll skip through that bit for now. So another thing that we can do is we can use dual coding. And you've probably heard of this already. And this involves presenting information with words and with images. And this encourages children to understand more. They understand what's being presented to them. But also the stores, as we looked at, the phonological store and the visual store are completely separate, so they don't really impede on each other. So this is a really good example, well, I thought anyway. So if we read the sentence, I didn't know what a pomelo was, and it caused me a level of confusion. And this was taken from the Teffat's memory course, which is amazing, this example. But then when we have a visual representation with it, we then understand, we have an idea of what the kind of thing it might be. And it allows us to understand why. It encourages our comprehension of the sentence through a use of a visual aid. Also, we use things like diagrams and things like that. They can really help children to understand things without impeding on any sound they're hearing or any sound-based storage. So it's a really effective tool to help children further understand a topic without impeding on their working memory storage. And this is just a few examples of the ways in which you can use it. So in the virtual school devised a sort of flow at the top of the screen, which tells children where they are at any moment. Again, it's very clean, very visual. The emotions as well that children can identify with in a check-in in the start of the lesson. It can help them understand those, which is such an important part of modern day learning. Abstract concepts as well, it's really, really useful to use. So inference is really tricky, and I know that I use so many images and so many analogies with inference to help children understand it. Vocabulary, we'll skip past that. This is just an example of a slide in which we can use tips and tricks to help children. So there's so many things going on at once when they're reading, but with kind of clear visual cues, you can help them and train them to look in this small part of the screen that can give them clues, tips and tricks to try and encourage their learning. You can also use it for, this is an example of a PSHE lesson, so you can try and use them for more abstract concepts as well. I just think it's a really great tool, and all the images that I've used are from Widget. I don't know if anyone uses Widget already. Does anyone use it? Okay, cool, great. Yeah, so it's just a great tool for that, and just knowing that it doesn't sort of impact on storage. Yes, the Noun project, and there's a few more links here as well. And there's something called I've looked at this recently. It's a software which children can use to draw and create, which can help them to store their own knowledge, almost like if they're revising for something or they're trying to get hold of a topic, they can use this tool to draw, to write, or to do anything like that as they go. And just quickly, it's really important to consider what images that you use. I used one recently to describe art, and I found that some of the things on Widget, they're not massively like concrete examples. They're actually quite abstract in of themselves. And I think sometimes with things like Widget or dual processing, we just sort of keep all the images, or we can keep all the images on without thinking whether they're actually a help to the children. So some of them, I think, and some of them that have been used in this example are almost too vague. And this is particularly true for SEN children. And what that can actually do is give them misconceptions. So it's just really important that wherever possible, choosing those concrete examples if we're using visual aids and dual coding. So just very brief summary for that. Sound reduction and no music. These are all things that reduce that extraneous cognitive load. Environment to be clear, and yes, same images all the time, consistency. So considering the inner ear at all times. So even a picture will evoke thought, which gives you which is still a sound inside your mind, which can displace other information. So whenever you're putting anything up in your environment, just consider the child's inner ear and how much that might cause the displacement of information from their working memory. Clean presentation at all times, text redundancy, thinking about that, the split attention effect, which we mentioned, so trying to avoid any diagrams that are used for learning being next to each other. Attention training is possible and is something that is being invested in quite a bit, but it's also important to know that working memory and attention are separate. And dual coding is so effective, but obviously it needs to be used in a way that doesn't promote misconceptions, particularly when working with SEN children. Now that's the main part. I'll look into intrinsic cognitive load briefly now. So basically this is about how we break down knowledge and how important it is to break down knowledge into steps. Also thinking about how many skills are being crossed over in a given task. So if we look at, I'll skip to this. So when we give a child a task, they obviously have a limited amount they can hold in their working memory. So I think it's important that when we present them with something, we really separate the skills and the knowledge. And obviously there's crossover within those. Just because I think by not doing that, we can cause almost like an overload through a crossover of different skills. So for example, for curriculum subjects, there's a big push to almost incorporate them as writing lessons as well. And I don't know whether that actually, for children who really struggle with writing, then sort of pushes out what you want from what perhaps is the main part of that humanities lesson, which is the acquisition of knowledge. And things like, I was talking to a year 6 teacher recently, and they said that at a certain point in fractions, rulers become less of a focus because they in of themselves become quite become a focus in the working memory that then pushes out information they actually need to solve the problem. And this led me into thinking of a question of how much, particularly in writing, when children succeed in their grammar lesson, they succeed in their spelling lesson, and then when it comes to the writing, they can't quite, they seem to forget what they've been taught. And I think sometimes it's important to think, is it because they don't understand how to apply them, or is it their working memory that just simply can't hold all that number of tools at the same time? And it's just that classic phrase that you hear kids saying, being like, oh yeah, I forgot. And you know they know how to do it. In this document, which I'll send you, this in Billsley, there's some really nice examples of how, like in science, how skills and knowledge have been separated, and also how the progression of skills and how they're broken down into chunks for writing. So here's a year 1 descriptor from a colleague called Isabel Guttridge, and here's a year 6 descriptor, which I think really demonstrates nicely the breakdown of knowledge into smaller parts, and the consideration of knowledge and skills. Now, obviously, there are children who need things broken down into even smaller pieces for them to understand things, and for them to retain these pieces in their working memory. And I think tutoring is a really good idea for that, but obviously, what is the government going to present with that? We don't know. And there's also evidence, obviously, there is more and more evidence for our mixed ability classrooms being successful, and effective use of teaching assistants and resources being able to increase that smaller breakdown of pieces for children, including those with poor working memory, in a mixed ability environment. There's a really good article there. I think using the tips for help as well is really important. So going back to the dual coding, children who need those bits broken down into smaller pieces, having those visual elements to encourage well-being, concentration, to give them reminders of what they should do, just because those are things that might be so easily lost for them because they're just desperately trying to retain information at one given point. I think that you can also teach children a few of those tricks. So, for example, vocalizing information allows us to, it increases the phonological store in our working memory. We can store more if we speak it. So encouraging children to sometimes speak, perhaps they speak out loud what they've learned. Mnemonics is another one. Stories is another one that seems to work really well with children, increasing their working memory. And also that you can, these are stores, the visuospatial store and the phonological store. They can be improved with practice, and included there's a few working memory tasks children can do repetitively to try and improve stores for both those things. And also remembering that everybody in their life has sensitive periods from when they're a young child and again when they're in adulthood. So when we use these tools successfully and we try and improve our working memory, that can have a long-term impact on our working memory. CPD knowledge, which I'm sure you know so much about, so I'll skip through that. I'm running out of time, so I'll skip through that for now. So finally, let's just go on to, finally, just quickly before we finish, sorry, because I know I'm already running over. One of the huge things that affects our working memory capacity is how much we know already. So if we're really unsure about, if something's totally unfamiliar, it takes more for us to process it and understand it, which places a higher demand on our working memory. So there are, let me just skip to this bit. So there's this idea at the moment that actually our working memory capacity never changes and it always stays the same. It's just that as a young child, we know so little about the world that we find it harder to process incoming information. We find it harder to assimilate things. So that's a really interesting point. I think obviously working memory does neurologically have a capacity, but it's interesting to think actually it doesn't necessarily increase neurologically. It actually is the same. It's just as a child we know so little about the world that it put such a strain on our working memory, because we're desperately trying to understand everything. I'll finish now, but within the rest of the slides, there are a lot of ways in which you can use familiarity of knowledge to increase working memory for children who are struggling. And the last thing I'd just like to say, there's lots of stuff, is that a huge impact, I think something that really impacts our working memory is how we feel, our well-being, massively. Anxiety has a huge impact on working memory, simply because our attentional processes are, if in a state of anxiety, they are actually being fine-tuned to focus on threat. And the last part I just want to say is just relate this to yourself, in that when things go wrong, sometimes it's not because you don't possess that skill in your long-term memory. It's just because you've got so much incoming information, with the way it's presented, your environment, your well-being, that you just might not be able to store it and use it at that time. And I know that's very true for teaching, definitely. And that's it, really. So all of those, all of the research I found and tips and tricks and things like that, they're all included in the slides, which I can send out, a lot of which I've skipped. But I hope that's provided some things for you. So yeah. Oh yeah, there's lots of reading on anxiety and working memory. And I will say, actually, this particular focus of mine in that, oh yeah, slide, yeah, absolutely. I'll provide the slides for everybody as well. Yeah, so you can actually, with people with anxiety, they instantly have this attentional bias to pay attention to threat and ignore everything else in their environment. So yeah, I'll provide literature on that. You're really welcome. I'm sorry if it was so rushed and a bit, but
Christie, I'm going to jump in there if that's
okay.
Right. Christie, don't apologise. That was fantastic. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
I'm just appearing here. Just to everybody on the call, my name's Carl Rogers and I'm Director of Billsley Research School. Firstly, I'd like to add my thanks to Christie for that. It was extremely informative, Christie, and I know you've got a wealth of knowledge that you could share with colleagues too.
Yeah.
Well. That just gave you a snapshot really there. And as a research school, we're keen to work with schools to support implementation of this, so it has a positive effect on pupils' learning. You've had kind of 45 minutes there. We do have we have a 9-module course, an online course which we can deliver to support you. That's 9 2-hour modules, and that focuses on that broader aspect of metacognition and self-regulation. Christie and colleagues have invested a lot of time in that, because we know, and the EF toolkit tells us that can have up to 7 months impact on pupils' progress in school. So it's certainly worth investing time in. We're keen to work with schools, local authorities and academy trusts. So if you want to find out more and you want support in terms of implementing that practice in your school, please do get in touch with us. We will share these slides from you, and once you've had a look at them, you might think, I want to learn more and I'd like to do more. So get in touch with us and let us know. But just finally from me, Christie, thanks very much for that. I thought that was a great session. Thank you for your time.
I'm sorry it's a bit rushed, but I will send everything through, anything anyone wants to know. Yeah, deprivation and working memory is a huge